There we go. All right. So I wanted to start just with kind of some context of the predators that we have here in California, because I think that's that's speaks to why we've looked at doing this with cattle as well as with small ruminants. And then just touch on kind of the importance of bonding, talk about the techniques that we used in this case, some of the troubleshooting things that we've done, and then hopefully be able to answer any questions that you've got. And just to kind of give you an introduction to my background, I am a county-based cooperative extension advisor, county agent. I work in 4 counties in kind of Northern California, north and northeast of Sacramento, clear to the Nevada line. And then, like a lot of bald guys, I wear multiple hats, and we also have our own small-scale sheep operation in the Sierra foothills. And this is a picture of one of our dogs and our sheep from a couple of years ago. So I've got a professional interest in these dogs and kind of how to make them be as effective as possible, but also a personal interest in it as well. So our predators in California are pretty similar to what you all face, with probably a couple of, at least one exception, in terms of the critters themselves. But I think the other key distinction here in California is how our state Fish and Wildlife Agency approaches predator protection, and that creates some challenges for producers here in California. So in our part of the state, we've got mountain lions, coyotes, black bears. We now have gray wolves as well. We haven't had them establish packs in the counties that I work in yet, but they're in the counties just to the north and the east of us. So we're likely going to get wolves in the not too distant future. What's different here is that we've got some state laws that are really challenging in terms of dealing with predators. So we have a state law that outlaws lethal control of mountain lions until a producer has tried at least 2 non-lethal methods. So if you have a mountain lion come in and kill a calf or kill sheep, you have to try new non-lethal methods that you haven't tried previously before Fish and Wildlife will issue a depredation permit. And as you can imagine, proving that it was the same lion that came back time after time can be challenging. We also have a law that has outlawed using hounds to hunt black bears. And as a consequence, we have not filled our tag quota for bear hunting since that law has passed. And so we've got a lot more black bears. Typically not a big issue with cattle producers, but on occasion, a black bear will take a calf and kind of develop a taste for beef. And then even though gray wolves are no longer listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, they are listed in California. And under our state Endangered Species Act, there is no lethal control, period, if they're killing livestock. It may even be difficult to get a lethal permit if they're a threat to human safety. We've also been told by our Fish and Wildlife Agency that if a dog were to injure a wolf, that might be considered a take under our state Endangered Species Act. And so California, to put it mildly, California is a complicated place to try to raise livestock. So one of the questions that we get a lot, and one of the reasons that we really tried to demonstrate how to bond a dog with cattle, is that we are getting questions from cattle producers in the northeastern part of the state about what might work to protect cattle from gray wolves. We also get a lot of questions about, well, can I just go out and buy an adult dog that's already started with livestock and put it to work right away? And I think that can work with an exceptional dog. But what we have found, and what I found in my own operation, is that bonding a dog with my livestock is really important. That can't be replicated. If it's bonded with somebody else's operation, there is at least an adjustment period when that adult dog comes to my outfit. I think the dog has to bond, but we also need to think about this being a two-way process. And so the livestock have to trust the dog and have to be exposed to the dog really as a pup to kind of create that two-way bond. I think dogs really bond with kind of the physical location and the operational characteristics as well. And so in our operation, I need a dog that's going to be comfortable with people riding bikes by the sheep and walking their own dogs by the sheep, as opposed to somebody that may be running an open range sheep outfit where they need dogs that are able to patrol a little more broadly. And I think that also plays into how cattle operations are run and what type of operation the outfit is. Is it stockers? Is it cow-calf? All of those things are part of exposing the pup early on to those different characteristics. I've had a couple of adult dogs that we've taken and had some success with. I've also had adult dogs that I've taken from other producers that was just transferring their problem to my operation. And so I think, well, it's attractive to think about getting a dog that's already ready to go. Sometimes I think you're buying somebody else's problem when you're taking an adult dog. And I think there can be some other issues with that as well. So one of the things we thought about in this particular project, and this is the dog that we bonded with cattle, and I'll kind of walk through this in a second. But one of the things that we talked about early on is what kind of operation are we looking at? Most of the producers in my counties are cow-calf operations. They may run some stocker cattle when we have an especially good grass year, but most of them are cow-calf producers. And so understanding what their vulnerability might be is really important as well. You know, with stockers, a wolf will take a yearling calf, but most of our operations are more concerned about coyotes and mountain lions while they're calving. And so thinking about when we need a dog, what time of year we would need a dog, what that dog has to be able to do in terms of coexisting with the cattle, is all part of that consideration. We started with a pup that was in kind of a mixed operation that had both stockers and cow-calf, and they were most concerned about their heifers calving. They felt like the experienced cows took pretty good care of their calves, but that the heifers were an area where they could use some help. And so that's kind of where we started with this dog. As Bill, no doubt, has really emphasized, a successful guard dog really starts with a successful puppy. And I think it's really critical to pick the right dogs. We feel like it's really important to select a pup from working parents. I will say in California, because there are so few cattle folks using dogs at the moment, it's difficult to find a dog that was from parents that were protecting cattle. But a set of working parents, I think, even if it's sheep or goats, is really critical. If it's possible, I really like to watch the parents working. I want to see what kind of environment they're in. I want to see kind of how the livestock respond to them and vice versa. And I think that, to me, suggests that it's really helpful to pick a pup from a working ranch as opposed to somebody that keeps a few livestock just to rear guard dogs with. That's not to say that there aren't breeders out there that do a really good job. But I really want to see the parents work if at all possible. I also want to see where the pups were whelped. And I've had my most success with dogs that were whelped in the presence of livestock, where those puppies could smell and hear livestock before their eyes were open. I think there's some really early bonding and kind of comfort level that is hardwired in if they're around stock when they're whelped. The other thing that one of my colleagues here in California has really worked on is kind of evaluating a puppy's play drive. And one of the things that we've started to do when we're selecting puppies here is to roll a ball by a litter of puppies and see if any of the puppies are interested in chasing that ball. Most guard dog puppies will not have any interest in chasing a ball, which I think translates to a lack of play and then subsequently prey drive. But that's a way to kind of think about the type of dog that you're selecting. I also, for my operation, like a middle of the road pup. I want one that isn't going to bound up and see me the first time I walk in the kennel. But I also want one that's not so terrified of me that it cowers in the back. One that ignores me is a pretty good middle of the road pup in my operation. And I think that's generally true for most operations. So our early bonding process with this dog, we purchased this dog from a goat operation in Central California. And we had about a 3 or 4 day stretch where we weren't able to get coordinated with the cattle operation, which is about a 5-hour drive from my place. And so our early bonding with this pup was to bring him home and put him with our sheep. We actually put him with some rams at our home place. And that got him exposed to electric fence, kind of got him, we made sure that he was with stock rather than with us. So we didn't interrupt that kind of socialization process. But then we transported him up to the cattle operation, and we built a pen for the livestock that he was going to be bonded with initially out of electronet fencing. So I think we put 5 calves in about a 2-acre paddock, probably a little bigger than what would have been ideal. But we put them inside the electronet fencing so that the dog had to stay with them, but also had to interact. We also built a safe zone for the pup to get away from the cattle, place where the pup could be fed. If he needed to get away from the cattle, he could get in there. And this hardwire pin that you see him in here is basically just an 8x8 pin built out of T-posts and cattle panels. We did initially put a tarp over it so we'd have a little bit of shade. The wind took care of the tarp pretty quick. But he did use that kind of as a safe zone, gave him a spot to go. We also, in this case, and I do this with my own dogs as well, decided that we would bond a single pup without a litter mate or an older dog, at least in the initial phase of the bonding process. And the reason for this is I really think that these dogs, kind of from the point of 8 weeks up to maybe 20 weeks of age, are really looking to form social bonds with somebody else. If it were a pet dog, we'd be trying to form that social bond between us and the pup. But because we want these dogs to spend their lives with the livestock they're supposed to protect, we want to make sure that there's nothing that gets in the way of that socialization with livestock. And what I found, if we're trying to bond litter mates or put a dog with an older dog, that social bond forms with the other dog rather than with the cattle or the sheep and goats. I think there's a variety of ways to do this, and I think Bill has, I think, tried some other ways as well. There's no right or wrong necessarily, but this is certainly what has worked best for me. All dogs, in my experience, get to be teenagers and they start acting like teenagers. And Sam, this guy, got to that point as well. They get to the point where they're almost mature in size, but they still want to play. And with sheep and goats in particular, that can be pretty hard on the livestock. Sam decided that because some of the new calves that we rotated through his pen wanted to run away from them, that it would be fun to chase. And so there's a couple of things we can do when the dogs reach this point. One of the things I do with my sheep dogs is that when they get to that point, I put them with rams. And our rams have very little sense of humor about a playful dog. They don't hurt the dog, but they also don't run away from him. And if the dog gets a little too much in their face, they'll butt him and kind of put him in his place. That has helped. I think our experience with Sam with cattle was that mature cows, dry cows, have very little sense of humor about a playful dog, and so that kind of helped curb some of his behavior. We also, as you can see from this picture, used a dangle stick, and Bill's got some um, great plans for putting one of these together. But it's basically just a stick that kind of hangs at knee level and makes running awkward and uncomfortable. And so I think that kind of encourages the dog to give up their playful behavior. I think in a lot of ways, working with these dogs is like training a horse or training a herding dog or using low stress techniques for working cattle. Really, what I think our job is as a trainer and a handler is to make the right thing easy for the dog and the wrong thing uncomfortable. And so if we can have the livestock make the wrong thing uncomfortable, that works really well. The dangle stick or other types of devices can make the wrong thing uncomfortable. I've even at this stage with dogs that are with sheep, if I can catch a dog in the act of doing something I don't want it to do, I will grab it by the scruff of the neck and growl at it like its mother would do. And that seems to have more of an impact. I think the really important point to all of this is that there's a difference between punishment and correction. Correcting a behavior requires you to be present for the behavior that you're trying to correct. If you're there 5 minutes after the dog has been chasing livestock and you punish the dog has no idea what it did wrong. But if you can correct it in the moment and really ask the dog to make a different decision in the moment that it's doing the wrong thing, I think that can have a pretty positive impact. Now, I did mention that bonding needs to work in both directions. We did move Sam to another operation after the initial bonding phase. The operation that we worked with in northeastern California just felt like it was too labor intensive. And so we moved him to a cow-calf operation down closer to where I am, Central California. And we started him with these heifers. They were pretty curious about him, and that really helped him kind of settle into the new environment. We did find in this new operation that these they had been experiencing quite a bit of coyote pressure, and so cows that had calves at their side were not thrilled about a dog being in their pasture. And so it took some time to get those cows to understand that they could trust the dog. The dog wasn't going to come after them or after their calves, and that helped. We also found that if we were bringing naive cattle into the bonding pen, it was good to leave one or two animals that already knew the dog, because they could help the naive cattle get more comfortable with the dog being with them. So kind of being thoughtful about how that process works is really important. We've talked to producers up in the Northern Rockies who have quite a bit of experience with wolves, and cattle that have been run by wolves are really difficult to get bonded to a dog. They're really leery of a big white dog. So, being thoughtful about having some cattle that are already trusting the dog as you introduce a dog into those new environments is really important. I think there's a kind of a final exam period for these dogs. And in my experience, a dog that's 18 to 24 months is probably just about ready to go through this final exam. In our operation, that means that we need a dog that we can trust during lambing. And I think in a cattle operation, depending on the type of operation you have, that would include calving. So we want to make sure that the dogs are trustworthy. We want to make sure that the dogs are respectful of a cow or a ewe or a doe that's in labor, uh, that is going to allow that cow to mother up with her calf. I have had intact female dogs that had such a strong maternal drive. The first time they saw a lamb being born, they thought the lamb was theirs. So kind of working through that is important. Sam is an intact male, so we didn't have that maternal issue. Uh, but really, really carefully evaluating that final stage in the time period where the livestock are most vulnerable. What I have found in our operation, and we have not had the ability to do this with Sam and the cattle, but I like to pair a young dog with an experienced dog during lambing. And I've got a couple of videos that I've shot of our older dogs chasing a young dog away from a ewe that's in labor, which has far more impact than me staying with the dog and yelling at him or growling at him. Now, you might think that these dogs are, hold on just one second. You might think that the older dogs are taking their teaching responsibilities really seriously. In my observation, it's that the older dog knows there's going to be afterbirth after that ewe is lambed, and doesn't want the young dog to get it. But the end result is the same. It reinforces for that young dog that it needs to keep its distance during lambing or calving. So Sam right now is currently living with some bulls on this operation in Central California. We're at a point where we want to work with this producer to test Sam in a pen without this electric fence. I think that Sam will be bonded well enough that he's not going to want to leave the cattle. But we're working through that with some folks that haven't had much experience with guard dogs, so we're taking our time with that. One of the issues in our part of the world with these dogs is if they roam to neighboring properties. A lot of our commercial ranches are kind of in the midst of rural residential landscapes, and so we want them to stay with the cattle. Roaming is different than patrolling. So understanding if a dog is leaving livestock because it's bored or just isn't well bonded is very different than a well bonded dog that wants to patrol kind of the outer edges of the property. Dogs that roam can be a real problem for us. So we've used some of the tools that Bill has suggested. The yokes, the dangle stick can help with that to some degree. But sometimes there are dogs that are just not well bonded enough, and they maybe need to go in a different environment where roaming isn't as big of an issue. Chasing is another problem that we try to break early on, and I think using those grumpy old rams or grumpy dry cows can help break a dog of chasing behaviors. The dangle stick is also a pretty useful tool for that. Sometimes they need a little reminder about that as a young dog, and so we don't leave the dangle sticks on long term, but sometimes if they need a refresher, we'll add that back to the mix. Aggressive play, particularly with lambs or calves, can be a real problem. I have had pretty good success in using again those older rams or older cows to break a dog of trying to play aggressively. But we are pretty cautious when the first time a new dog goes through a lambing season, just to make sure that they're not trying to play with the lambs. We have had dogs that will kill sheep, sometimes intentionally, sometimes just by being overly protective. I've got the dog that I showed with my sheep in one of those early slides. If this will come as a great shock to everybody, but sometimes sheep get sick and sometimes they even die. And my dog will notice a sheep that's not feeling right sometimes before I will, and will lay with and lick on that sheep, sometimes to the point of licking them raw. And so just have to be on top of our husbandry to make sure that we're noticing some of those things before the dog does. A dog that's killing lambs or killing calves probably is not a dog I would keep. Sam developed kind of a protectiveness of water troughs and feed troughs for a stage of his bonding process, where he would only let the cattle come up and eat hay if he decided it was okay. And so kind of working through correcting that behavior, being out there and physically correcting a dog that is keeping cattle away from a water trough or away from the feed trough can be a pretty useful tool in solving that problem. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. I'll stop sharing so we
If someone wanted to build a pen, a bonding pen for puppy or puppies to use to facilitate bonding to cattle, what would be the minimum size of a bonding pen? And you had mentioned that the 2 acres was maybe a little bit too big. So what would be an ideal size?
That's a great question, and I'd be interested in Bill's thought on that too. I think kind of an acre paddock where the dog has to interact with the cattle, but has some space to kind of roam, and so that the cattle can kind of engage in reasonably natural behaviors where they're not in a kind of a pen situation, but more in a grazing situation. Bill, what's your thought about that? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
I would agree with you that our bonding pens at the center are 1 acre. We start out in a 60 by 60 pen with the sheep and goats, and then it moves into a 1 acre pen. If I was going to do cattle, yeah, I would probably go with the 1 acre pen, or maybe even if you could start, those. It really seems those first so we get puppies at 8 weeks. So those first 4 weeks, that you have them is really kind of the end of that bonding time. So if you could have them maybe in a 1/2 acre pen, then transition them to a 1 acre pen. That's probably what I would try if I was going to repeat the process.
What age?
Yeah, I think go ahead.
What age would you put the pups in with, or what age of cattle would you put the puppies in with?
That's another good question. We had, I'll tell you what we did and then kind of what we learned. We started the pup with some leppy calves, some bottle raised calves that were pretty friendly to people, just because we felt like we could get them into this pen reasonably easy. They were probably 4 or 5 month old calves. I think ideally what I would want to do is probably weaned heifers or dry cows. I think the problem with these calves that were so friendly was that their behavior was a little different than what I would call real cattle, And I think it's important for the dog to have some animals that aren't going to run away from him, that are going to want to interact, but are going to act like cattle should act, if that makes sense. And with sheep, what I do, and Bill may do something a little different. I start the young pups with dry ewes, just because those ewes are used to being around dogs. They're not going to run away from a pup that thinks it wants to play with them. And it kind of starts us off on the right foot, I think.
Hey, Dan, did you progress the pens in size over time, or did you just have that one size pen and then release the pup?
We did. We expanded the pen as the pup got better bonded, and I think the ideal now he's just coming on 2 years old, and our next step will be to put him with these calving cows in about a 300-acre field. What we did find, even as he matured, this operation where we're at now had somebody coming to hunt coyotes once a week, and they typically killed 2 or 3 coyotes a week in this 300-acre property. And since the pup is there, they have not killed a coyote. So even though the pup doesn't have access to the whole 300 acres, there's something about the presence of a dog like that that has disrupted kind of the coyote, normal coyote movements in that environment. And so I want to play around with that. There may be different ways to use these dogs to influence predator behavior beyond kind of my normal approach, having the dog have access to the whole pasture. Good question.
They stay in there.
Any other?
They're wanting to know how long the pup should stay in those pens, while you're looking for that correct behavior to happen.
I'm going to give you the traditional extension answer. It depends. It really depends on what the dog's telling you. And I think if the dog desires to be with livestock more than with the herding dogs or the people that are coming to feed them, I think that's a really good sign. We found with Sam in the first operation, we had a snowstorm that pushed the fence down, and so Sam could get out. He actually came up to the ranch headquarters one morning because the fence was down, and he decided that he'd much rather be with his calves. He went back through the down fence and stayed with his calves. And so I think that kind of behavior cue tells us that he can be trusted in a bigger environment than that initial bonding pen. If he were still trying to get away from livestock, we would continue to try to keep him in a smaller environment where he couldn't get away. And that's why we used the electric fence. He couldn't get through the electric fence, at least initially. But I'd kind of take my cues from the dog. If the dog wants to be with livestock, then we can start trusting the dog in some bigger situations. Does that make sense?
Hey, Dan, any idea? I know this is real new. You're still in a very young project still. Any clue like on a number of dogs to number of cattle? I mean, like I kind of recommend, like one dog per 50 head, give or take, a whole bunch of variables. But any idea so far?
That's the $64,000 question. I think it really depends on the environment and on the predator pressure. I work with an outfit, a sheep outfit that runs free range sheep on Forest Service grazing permits in the High Sierra. They're dry ewes in the summertime when there's lots of other things for those predators to eat. And so they get by with 1 or 2 dogs per 1,000 head of sheep. At lambing time, that band of sheep is going to need 5 or 6 dogs. So it really depends on the situation and the environment. I think in our foothill country, where it's reasonably open country and the predators are mostly going to be coyotes and an occasional mountain lion, a dog per 100 cows is probably going to be sufficient. If they were up in wolf country, I think we'd want significantly more dog power. There is some research that suggests there's kind of a critical mass that if you get too many dogs, they start acting more like a pack as opposed to a guardian. And that number seems to be in the 8 or 9 dog range. If you've got a group of cattle or a group of sheep with 8 or 9 dogs, those dogs are spending more time with each other than they are guarding. But I think, again, it really depends on the environment and on the predators and on the time of year production cycle.
Well, folks, any other questions while we got Dan?
I got one. We were talking about where you had a ewe that was having like a lamb, and you had an older dog, and then you have this younger dog. Well, then that it would scold off the younger dog. Will there ever be a time where that younger dog will say, "Hey, it's going to be okay for me to clean up the lamb and the ewe," you know, or hope. I've been schooled this by an older dog.
Yeah. What I have observed, and I've observed this with a couple of different dogs now, so it's certainly not research based, but it's pretty strong observation. That typically happens. We try to have the young dog with the older dog before we've started lambing. And so typically with my dogs, I can tell when we've started lambing because the dog doesn't come up to be fed when I get out to check the sheet. The dog is laying 20 yards off from the ewe that's in labor, or 20 yards off from the new set of lambs. What I've observed with these young dog interactions is that when that first lamb hits the ground, the older dog chases him off. And it may happen on a couple of occasions. The young dog is typically pretty curious about what's going on, but the older dog won't let the young dog close to it, the situation. At some point, we get into the middle of lambing season, and we've got multiple lambs hitting the ground every day, and the older dog can't get around to every ewe to chase the young dog off. But by that time, the young dog has kind of realized, hey, I need to give these animals a little bit of space. I will get to clean up the afterbirth, but I need to give them space right now. And that, for whatever reason, that initial lesson seems to really stick with the dogs. At some point, there's too many lambs coming for the older dog to worry too much about it.
Any other questions,
Good
folks?
question.
Well, I think that's it, Dan. I sure appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to talk about this project you've been working on, and I'm looking forward to hearing some more about what your findings are. So, but
Well,
take
thank
care.
you so much for the invitation, and Bill, feel free to share my contact information with folks there if they've got other questions.
Certainly will. Thanks a lot, Dan. You take care. Our prayers are with you.
Thanks all. Thank you very much.